Good afternoon, everyone. Let us pray. O God, whose providence never fails in its design, keep from us, we humbly beseech you, all that might harm us, and grant all that works for our good. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. I'm so happy to see so many of you joining us this afternoon for this webinar. My name is Father Dennis Gill, and I am the current president of the Society for Catholic Liturgy. I'm also the rector of the Cathedral Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, as well as the director of the Office for Divine Worship here in the Archdiocese. This webinar is part one of a series of 3 under the title, The Celebration of the Liturgy is an Encounter with the Risen Lord, Challenges Presented by COVID-19. For nearly 3 months, Catholics all throughout the United States have experienced many different approaches to keeping holy the Lord's Day, with a near universal suspension of the public celebration of Mass. Now, as many states throughout the nation are gradually opening up for in-person events, Catholics have or will be returning to Mass and the celebration of the other sacraments with some restrictions. This experience has placed the celebration of the sacred liturgy, whether live streaming or in person, as a central focus. These webinars are intended to generate a response to many of the challenges to the celebration of the liturgy by COVID-19 and offer a pathway to move forward. This first webinar is entitled Adjustments to Given Liturgical Norms, What is the Starting Point? Essentially, we want to establish with the sacred liturgy as a given for the encounter with the risen Lord. How then do we make adjustments required for safety and other serious needs? Joining me today is Father Daniel Cardo, the pastor of Holy Name Parish in Inglewood, Colorado, and Christopher Karstens, director of the Office for Sacred Worship in the Diocese of La Crosse, Wisconsin. Both are members of the Society. Tim O'Malley, the vice president and treasurer of the Society, will be our moderator. The chat box will be open for you to enter questions that you may have as we proceed through the webinar, and Tim will moderate the Q&A period after the 3 of us have a chance to give a brief presentation. I'll go first, Father Daniel will follow me, and then Chris will follow. Basically, we want to give a state of the question and then have a conversation vis-a-vis the questions that you may have. Father Daniel Cardo has to leave the webinar after a half hour's time. So let's begin. I'm sure that many of you are here on the webinar because you have an interest in the topic and would like to know just what is the starting point when we have to make adjustments to the celebration of the sacred liturgy. I would like to backtrack a little bit from today. COVID-19 did not catch us by surprise. At least here in the area, we were aware of it for a couple months before we had to make any kind of provisions. And our provisions at first were rather insignificant. The very first things that we did here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia in response to the virus was to send out a message to all of our pastors and all of our priests saying, we don't know what's going on with the virus, but it seems that the real issue is person-to-person contact. And so for the foreseeable future, we're going to suspend the invitation to the exchange of the sign of peace and also the distribution of the precious blood of the Lord. it seemed we put that announcement out, and 2 weeks later, we were suspending the public celebration of Mass. And that caught people really hard. And so, without a lot of reflection, we were doing all sorts of things to help people keep holy the Lord's Day. There was the possibility of live stream celebrations and the expected but unfortunate pre-recorded celebrations that had absolutely no respect for sacramental time or the sacramentality of time. And now we're opening up. And here, at least in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, in this part of the state of Pennsylvania, the opening is gradual and slow, but it's opening with restrictions, and restrictions that impact the celebration of the sacred liturgy. And through it all, during the period of suspension and as we're opening up, there has been a heightened concern about the distribution of Holy Communion that has introduced or allowed all kinds of practices that are almost impossible to contain, let alone address. For me, the challenge has been asking the people here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, our pastors and our people, the question that is the question of this webinar. And that is, what is the starting point? All of you know the anxiety, the fear, the concern that surrounds the virus, and it affects all of us in every part of our life. And the CDC has made it very clear that the 3 mitigating standards are essential, even as the virus lessens. That we need to wash our hands and be very much aware of sanitation. That we need to maintain a reasonable distance from one another. And that the numbers that can assemble need to be rather small, at least up until now. And what I noticed is that people in our area, instead of starting with the sacred liturgy, especially during the restricted period that we're in now, began with the restrictions and allowed the restrictions to give shape to worship. And one of the things that uncovered for me is that many people did not have a real sense of what is the purpose and the nature of the sacred liturgy. And therefore, the liturgy wasn't the starting point. I think one of the things that is really essential, if we look at how we can make adjustments, is that what has to be at the center when we're talking about the liturgy is the experience of worship. And if that's our starting point, then we take it further.
It's a church.
What is worship?
People
and
around
how
the
does
country.
this worship take
Sorry,
place?
I apologize. Greg,
It's a
could you
Zoom
please
meeting.
get off mute, or you somehow have unmuted yourself, please, Greg. Sorry, Father Dennis, go ahead.
No problem. Is trying to help people corporately understand what is worship and how does this worship take place. And I think at the heart of the question is a recovery that the celebration of the liturgy, all the sacraments, before it's anything else, is a divine event. And we have lost a capacity to have this type of conversation. And because we've lost a capacity to have this type of conversation, we've lost a pastoral understanding of how to make the adjustments we need to make. That central to our worship is the actual event of Christ dying and rising. It takes place now, as it took place in history, and as it takes place in eternity. That's how God is glorified. That's how we share in the holiness of God. Our Archbishop recently wrote to the people of Philadelphia, inviting them to come home as we open up our churches this Sunday in the Archdiocese. And it hasn't been uncommon for me to hear from our parishioners how they have really become very comfortable with virtual worship and how they shop the net for the most satisfying or pleasing experience of the liturgy with good music, a good location, good preaching. And what I don't hear in that conversation is this communion that belongs to the church of being united to the action of Jesus in his divine event, his Paschal mystery, which is at the heart of our understanding of Christian worship. And so if we allow that to be our starting point, and that is the liturgy as a given, then we can understand that the church does want us to make necessary adjustments, especially in a restricted period in which we find ourselves. It's not foreign to the church's pastoral concern that we be safe when we worship, that the three mitigating standards are definitely possible when we look at the celebration of the Eucharist. It is possible for us to be sanitized, our buildings and our persons, to have a reasonable distancing when we assemble, but not to be arbitrary. In the time in which I see we are right now and responding to COVID-19, with all due respect for the right concern that we should have for one another's health, and that's a corporate concern and a concern that we have out of charity and justice, in many instances, it had the priority over the experience of worship. I'm going to now invite Father Cardot to offer some thoughts.
Thank you, Father Dennis. And I'm going to offer just some brief remarks so that we have more time for a Q&A, which I'm sure all of you are expecting. And I want to connect my brief reflection with what Father Gale was saying about the centrality of what happens in the liturgy as what should dictate what we do, and therefore how we discern this very strange time in which we all, I mean, it's a first time for everyone, so we do need to discern, but for that we need a foundation. And I just want to reflect briefly on one aspect, one spiritual dimension of this foundation, which is a question about how God can be working through all of this. Of course, it's a very difficult situation, but God certainly is present. How can God help us, especially during the times in which basically no public masses were allowed, and now that we can slowly start resuming the public celebration of the liturgy, what spiritual fruit can we find? And from the beginning of this experience, I've been thinking a lot and reflecting here at my parish and also teaching at the seminary on the importance of the pedagogy of desire, renewing our longing. The fact that no one chose to stop going to Mass, of course, as sad and as difficult as it has been, also became an occasion to interrupt our routine. And I think more or less we all have experienced some routine, entitlement, we own this, it's our right. But God can bring a very beautiful fruit of all of this, and that is through renewing our desire. And I think if we connect with this idea and help our people to understand that this is in many ways a wonderful occasion to renew their longing for Christ and his sacrifice, there will be abundant fruits. It comes to mind, well, the many times in which St. Augustine would speak about this to his congregation, but I just want to read a very brief part of one of his homilies in the first letter of John, when he says, God stretches our desire through delay, stretches our soul through desire, and makes it large enough by stretching it. Let us desire then, for we have to be filled. And to me, this can really explain in a very beautiful and realistic way what we should be experiencing and what we should promote in this time. This is a time to desire because we need to be filled. And as we are beginning now to come back to our churches with all the care and responsibility that we owe our parishioners and our society, we need to place our eyes there. And that has to determine what we do. coming to a second very brief point, what we do as experiences that we've been having here in the Diocese of Denver, we started public masses with many restrictions 3 weeks ago, or 4 if I'm not wrong, 3 weeks ago, I think. Inside our buildings, very limited to 10, but that opened the opportunity of what seemed unthinkable in many ways, but has been working wonderfully in a number of places, and that is outdoor masses. And I don't mean necessarily a drive-through kind of service, but an actual celebration in which you set a beautiful altar and offer the Mass with no less solemnity than inside. An outdoor setting becomes a very beautiful setting if it's well prepared, in which the liturgy is what really determines what we do, and in which we can as well take care of all the precautions that are so important and so necessary in terms of health and all of that. The centrality is what we do. I think that if we discern based on what we have to do, based on our desire for the celebration of the liturgy, then we will be able to apply these principles to the many, many different circumstances in which we all are trying to serve to the Church. I'm going to leave this opening statement just here so that then Chris can continue, and then we can move on to the Q&A.
Thank you, Father Cardell. Chris.
Thank you, Father Dennis. Thanks to each of you for being here at this webinar. My name is Chris Karstens. I'm the director of the Liturgy Office in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I'm also the father of 8 children in rural Wisconsin, so I have a different perspective to a certain degree from Father Dennis and Father Daniel. Maybe the first lesson that I learned over the past 3 months is that I'm not nearly as smart as I thought I was. So many things I don't know anymore. If I ever did. We certainly didn't have a class like this back in liturgy school at the Liturgical Institute. But it seems to me, whatever the problems and the dilemmas are, they really, from my work as a, an associate of the bishop and giving him recommendations, is how, whether, and to what degree can the normative liturgy be adapted to these abnormal times. And when Father speaks about taking the liturgy as given and the encounter with Christ, the resurrected Christ, as the starting point, it seems to me, and this is a point that I think is emerging in my own mind over these past months, that we can look at this in 2 different ways. The first way, and the most substantial and fundamental and baseline way, is that the liturgy as a given is the accommodation of Christ to us, which began at the Incarnation, and of course before the Incarnation, and that continues in the liturgical life of the Church. And that is non-negotiable in whatever liturgical adaptations we might be considering. It's about a fundamental encounter with Jesus. But we can take this a second way too, that this fundamental accommodation and encounter and worship and adoration that is the dynamic at base of the liturgy takes a ritual form that's codified by norms and rubrics and laws and legislation and all of the rest. Now, these 2 things are, of course, related, but they're not the same. And I think this is, as I say, is the point that's become clear to me over these past months, that taking the liturgy as an encounter with Christ is non-negotiable, but apparently, due to the circumstances, many things that under so-called normal conditions, whatever those might be, would be seen as aberrations or even liturgical abuses are encouraged at times. So let me give you just a couple of examples of what I mean. One from kind of the front end of closing down things, a second from in the midst of them, and a third as I'm trying to help my bishop open up things. The first is, take for example, the blessing and potential distribution of palms on Palm Sunday, right? So the Holy See gave norms, guidelines, recommendations, whatever they were, that parishes at least were to use the first option for the beginning of Palm Sunday, which includes no blessing in distribution and procession with palms. So a lot of pastors asked, well, what do I do with this shipment of palms that I have in my refrigerator? Can I bless them outside of Mass If so, what text do I use? Do I use those from the Missal? Do I use one of the texts from the Book of Blessings for blessing religious articles? Can I hand them out that day? Can I hand them out later that week? Should I hang on to them until after the pandemic has passed? See, whatever the solution is, whatever the answer to that question is, all of those are in a certain way illicit. They're not envisioned by the norms of the church. Okay? Here's another one. And Father Daniel, I almost resist bringing this up, but let's talk about the parking lot masses. Right? So this, in my diocese at least, is not something that our diocese had been recommending. Other dioceses, while not recommending, had been allowing them. Still other dioceses outright had been encouraging them. And even in some places, the bishop himself was celebrating parking lot masses. Right? So again, under normal circumstances, I think this is in Redemptionis Sacramentum somewhere, where it talks about the place for the liturgy is to be a sacred place, and the bishop will, if a necessity arises, it's the bishop himself who will make a determination on a case-by-case basis. So, I mean, 6 months ago, if we were doing this, nobody would think it's a good idea. But now, we do think it's a good idea. At least it's debatable. Here's a final example. And this has to do with what lies ahead of us in the Diocese of La Crosse. Dioceses had the option to celebrate the Chrism Mass during Holy Week or to defer it until a safer time. Well, our diocesan Chrism Mass will be Friday of the 12th week in Ordinary Time. That's the 26th of June. Okay. So already we're outside of the norms. Now, that fundamental liturgical principle that it remains an encounter with God's church, with Christ, that it celebrates the anniversary of the priesthood, and I suppose to a certain extent the institution of the Eucharist, those don't change, but the sacramental medium, the calendar, and all these other things are different enough that they're abnormal adaptations in abnormal times. Does that make them not, good ideas or allowed or whatever they are? So, but in conclusion to all of this, it just doesn't seem enough to be able to look simply to liturgical law and rubrics and norms and guidelines. Now, that's not to say that those are somehow out the window and anything goes. It's just to say that something more is required than looking to those things and looking to that more fundamental liturgical truth that whatever form this ritual takes, it's meant to adore God and sanctify his people. So that's been the real tricky question for me and probably for many of you. When Father Dennis talked about what is the starting point, I almost wondered if we couldn't call it, what is the ending point? Because at what point do adaptations cease to become advisable? Where does it stop? So that's all I have for a start.
Chris, I think you raised some points that I want to take a little further, okay? We're not talking about following or not following rubrics. We're talking about something much more fundamental. And there were three things that emerged from Chris's points that I think we should revisit. First of all, how do we actually encounter the risen Lord in the celebration of the liturgy? The Ascension is my favorite day in the year. And here in the East, we celebrate the Ascension still 40 days after Easter. And one of the things about that day that still fascinates me is in the whole plan of salvation, because Jesus ascended and the Father and Son sent the Spirit, we have the risen Lord in our midst. And we encounter him in very tangible ways in the celebration of the liturgy and the sacraments. That's part of the given that Chris was identifying. But we need to really spend time on the encounter. For many people, the celebration of the liturgy is something that they know is happening more than a full experience of their person with the person of the risen Lord. And therefore, the divinization that's possible isn't always fully appreciated. So you see, it's not just about rubrics. And the second thing is the sacramentality of time. You know, when COVID locked down Italy, there was the suggestion on the part of some that the date of Easter be moved because it was going to occur right in the middle of the lockdown in Italy. And the Holy See forcefully came out and explained it is not possible to change the date of Easter. There's something cosmic about everything we do in the liturgy. And it's only cosmic because it's the event of Jesus on the cross and risen from the dead that actually occurs, that recreated all and gave a new definition to time and how we observe time as Christians. When you were talking about the Chrism Mass, it's inconceivable to me that the Chrism Mass is happening after Easter because it points to the vigil and the use of the oils, etc. But anyhow, the sacramentality of time, and people easily put that aside today. And the third thing is that even during this COVID period and coming out of the isolation of COVID, everything we do is formational. And it has an impact for what happens next with the believing people. And those 3 points I just wanted to highlight a little bit based on what you said, Chris, because in many of our churches, Palm is going to be given out here in the Archdiocese this coming Sunday. What do you do? Okay, thank you. Father Cardo, did you want to follow up with anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, I love that even as we're beginning now, there are evidently questions that are open. You know, what you said about the Christian Mass, or what Chris mentioned even about using a parking lot for a Mass, of course, if the bishop approves. I mean, how much room is there for discernment? I think that makes this webinar all the more valuable, precisely because no one is going to recite the answers of a handbook that was written for liturgy in times of pandemic, but we're trying to discern based on our love for Christ and his church. So I just wanted to say that I don't see I mean, I find it beautiful that we can actually have a conversation about this.
Okay. Tim, I think we're ready to start the Q&A.
All right, so questions are available, or you can put questions within the Zoom group chat. You'll look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Click on that and you can put questions. We have one question from Colleen Darland. What are your thoughts on abbreviating the liturgies once in-person masses are opened? To minimize a prolonged exposure is the goal, but what still maintains the liturgical experience of Christ? Thanks, Colleen.
Okay, may I start with that question?
Yes.
Gentlemen, okay. Well, I think it's important that we pay attention. In fact, we must pay attention to the mitigating standards of the CDC during this time of pandemic and post-pandemic times. Social distancing is very important. And so what does that look like on a Sunday celebration? Well, I think the one thing we want to keep in mind is we should not distort the rites. For instance, many dioceses suggest that the deacon always stand 6 feet away from the celebrant. One of the roles of the deacon is to assist the celebrant. It's very hard to assist someone 6 feet away from that person. So I think there are other things that we can do. Certainly the processions can be streamlined. I don't see any part of the Mass that should not take place. But I think all throughout the Mass, there should be just reasonable distancing. I'm not so sure how shortening something to less than an hour is a positive position to take, especially as the virus is lessening and we're able to celebrate in person. I think it's more important for us to observe the issue of distancing, already presuming that the place has been sanitized and people themselves are careful about their own washing of their hands.
Yeah. May I say something also, because I do need to leave, and I apologize, but I had a meeting already planned a while ago. But I think also in terms of common sense, being exposed to someone, I mean, after 10 minutes, you've kind of been exposed. So if the mass lasts 50 or 60 minutes, I think it's more or less the same. I would just encourage to see a different angle, agreeing with all the precautions of sanitizing and all of that and distancing. I think we need to consider as well the longing of the people to come back to church. And when they come back, they do need to experience the beauty of the liturgy. They need to experience the glory of the Lord. And I would actually encourage putting our efforts in keeping everything as clean as possible, and the distancing and the planning on all of that, and doing liturgies that will be so memorable that I think that's what people need both. With this, I have to say goodbye. So sorry about that again, but it was great to be here even briefly. Take care.
Father Daniel, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you.
Bye, God bless.
I hope that Chris and I can handle these questions without you.
There are some doozies coming in, so be ready. Next question, Mary Johnston has asked that she's, or noted that she's concerned about abnormal practices that need to be established just for a time may give way to accepting them in general. For example, in Detroit, or I think Delaware, we're not to sing or to speak together. Is there any fear that this could lead to silent masses? That's just a question from her.
This has not been an easy topic, especially the whole topic of singing. And in fact, our next webinar next Thursday is on this topic, and Mary Catherine Levery will lead that webinar. When I say the Lord be with you, I expect you to respond, and with your spirit. There is something that happens in that exchange that only happens in that exchange. And that is a manifestation of who is actually carrying out this event of worship. It is Christ, and Christ as he's sacramentally expressed in the priest and baptized together. The principal instrument all throughout the liturgy for the priest, the deacon, the liturgical minister, the assembly, is the human voice. And for us to somehow quell that voice is counterindicative to what worship is. That is the public celebration of the mystery of Christ. And then we understand, as Roman Catholics, that the expression of worship should be sung. Because when we sing it, we give an emphasis to the theological value of what's happening. So when I sing "The Lord be with you" and you respond and with your spirit, it's a very strong and powerful statement of the Christ at work in this worship. And now all of a sudden we're saying that we should whisper and not sing. Well, my concern is that that sometimes is an unreflected response in dealing with the situation in which we find ourselves. There's lots of concern about the aerosols and the impact that it might have. But at the same time, we can be responsible and carry out the liturgy in a typical way that's safe. You can sing in a way that's not shouting. It can be somewhat minimized, I suppose, the sound of your voice or the force of your voice. But I agree with the person who asked the question that we need to be careful of introducing practices that are considered abnormal to the liturgy as if there's something good about them that might be imitated in the future. This is the example of knowing the starting point. And so when adaptations are made, necessary as they may be, they flow from an understanding of the starting point. I hope that was helpful.
Father Dennis, my opinion is that it could be a fear. Anytime people get involved, there's a chance that things are going to go wrong. And so
I
this
tend to
could
be
be
more
fear, but
optimistic.
I think that what I'm hoping will happen among priests and pastors and fathers of families and us and liturgy directors and whatnot is to sort of take this time to refocus on how we might kind of a control, alt, delete, and how we might do things when more properly, kind of this examination of conscience that John Paul II would speak about often. So, for example, the exchange of peace has been omitted in most places, and some people will say, "Yeah, we've finally gotten rid of the sign of peace. We don't have to bring it back." Why not we take this time so that we can bring it back in a way that is actually an occasion of grace and prayer and communion among the mystical body of Christ, or along the lines of singing. Great, we don't have to be singing all these songs now. No. There should be a time to reevaluate. I've seen what I think are very good suggestions is to sing what the church puts forth as normative in the first place. Dialogues and responses, acclamation, the ordinary of the Mass. So hopefully what this abnormal time can do is not foster more an abnormal return, but give us a pause to reflect and think about the liturgy in such a way that when we come back, we can do it more robustly. See, Jesus is still doing his work. I'm in still need of his salvation, but it's that sacramental medium that's governed by our rubrics and norms that is really where I was going to say magic, the spark, the reality, that's the touch point of all of this. And that's what's at stake in the liturgy.
Chris, I couldn't agree with you more. But again, we need to foster that proper understanding of what is the exchange of the sign of peace. That's not just going to happen without a sound presentation of what it is. And simply to have it absent and then reintroduce it without that, it will become what it was, that handshake with the neighbor. So that's a lot of work that we need to do. And I agree that instruction, catechesis is important. It's hard to do it all at once. Tim.
So now a question that takes that in another direction. Karen from the Archdiocese of Louisville has asked, okay, so when all is safe once again, is there actually anything from the pandemic and the adaptations to the liturgy that you hope remains? That actually there might be something worth holding on to or thinking through.
Chris, do you want to start there?
Sure. I think, all right, so again, I'm a layman and I have been to few masses over the last 3 months. And I'm a father of a family. And so we've had to look elsewhere. And we've done two principal things that I hope will be fruits for us and possibly for others. Is one, in a certain sense, is kind of this notion of spiritual communion writ large, namely that teaching my kids and learning myself and others to see behind, as important as the sacramental tapestry is, to see behind those, beneath those, to Christ who is acting and coming to meet us in the liturgy. So I hope that's one perspective that will stick and remain, that there's something more fundamental. It's the most fundamental thing in the liturgy, and that's the work of Christ. And so I hope that perspective remains for me and those who I have influence with. Second, and I don't know, I maybe unique in this way is I even run the TV Mass apostolate for the Diocese of La Crosse, but I confess that the family got a little, we about had enough TV Mass by Divine Mercy Sunday. So what we did is we got in the car and we drove to the parish, which was still open. We learned how to pray morning prayer together. And for the last month, even during the week now, my wife and I and the older kids are praying lauds almost every day. And that's another thing that I hope will last. And whether your family or your people, your parishioners are doing that as well, hopefully some of those things that have stepped in to fill the gap will remain. Father Dennis?
Yes. One of the things that I have noticed, at least here, both in masses that I've been watching that have been live streamed, although I don't like to do that, is that there has been an increase in silence. And I'm not sure why that is happening. The liturgy calls for silence. Silence is not an option. It calls for silence before we even begin, before the word is proclaimed, in addition to the times we have become accustomed to seeing silence. And silence, since the reform of the rites of the sacred liturgy, is a liturgical act that we haven't really come to understand what that means. It's a corporate act in which everyone participates. It's the same as singing a psalm together. It brings a different dimension of our person for a communal participation in God and his grace, so that with his grace, so that we might arrive to a new place through the power of the Spirit in the moment of worship. So maybe I'm just noticing that here and there, but that's something I think that needs to be recovered, and I hope will continue. There's not much more, though, that I've noticed, but that I see as a positive. But I am generally optimistic. I want to say that again. Okay, Tim.
Okay, great. So we're getting a couple questions. I won't name names because it's come in 2 or 3 different times, but specifically around questions around the reception of the Eucharist, whether it's receiving it on the way out the door, whether it's the elimination of receiving it on the tongue, sort of while kneeling, there's denying, do bishops have the right to do that? So there's a variety of questions linked to reception of the Eucharist.
Go ahead, Father Dennis.
All right. I have been doing an awful lot of thinking about this. And I think we're paying the price for something today. We have become too comfortable over the years separating out communion from the Eucharistic prayer. It's not uncommon for communion services here, there, and everywhere. We have a convent of the Sisters of Mercy of Alma here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, a wonderful group of sisters. And on Friday afternoons, myself and another priest have been rotating offering Mass there. Well, last Friday, as you might be aware, things were starting to become rather unsettled here in the city of Philadelphia, and we had a weekend of riots, and I was involved in some communications issues as far as that was concerned that day, and I was running late. And the superior called and said we could have a communion service. Well, I usually don't raise my voice, but she said I shouted and said, "No, I'll be there for Mass." And I realized that that was something happening inside of me about this whole question. We have really lost sight, and forgive me for saying this, that the central action of the Mass is the Eucharistic prayer. It's in the praying of that prayer where the priest and people together enter into the sacrifice of Christ as it's actually occurring. That is the sacrament. And I don't want to take away from the wonder and beauty of receiving our Lord's holy body and blood. But we have separated out communion from the Eucharistic prayer. And so communion becomes, for many people, something that they want and want on their own terms. And we forget that we're actually eating and drinking the death of the Lord. As St. Paul reminds us in his letter to the Corinthians, and as we also sing as one of the responses to the mystery of faith. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that for many, the reception of Holy Communion is not an intimate encounter with the risen Lord. It's done with faith and reverence, believing it's the body of the Lord, but not going beyond that. And the Church's rites that surround Holy Communion, going back through the centuries, outside of a pandemic, has been everything surrounding the reception of Holy Communion as flowing from the Eucharistic prayer, and people eating and drinking the death and resurrection of the Lord, and the principal act of personal adoration for everyone who receives, because that is when they ingest the action of Christ giving his life to the Father, risen among us. And so, Holy Communion, therefore, should be received during Mass. It flows from the Eucharistic prayer. I recognize the Thomistic Institute gave 3 different options and that many dioceses follow them. I'm comfortable with Holy Communion not being given at all, although CDC is very clear that you cannot spread the contagion through food. But I am not comfortable with it being taken out of the context of Mass, separated from the Eucharistic prayer, because its meaning lies in that connection. Now, the manner of reception. Everything about the way we receive should manifest the faith and our adoration of this event of Christ on the cross and risen from the dead that I'm now going to say amen to. And so there needs to be a regard for people's response in faith, but at the same time, protecting the safety of those who are distributing and receiving. And so we're walking a really fine line here, a fine line. And so I think following what the Church already gives to us as the norms for the reception of Holy Communion, with a sense, with having in mind the need for clean hands and also social distancing, there isn't a real need to disturb the ritual action of the distribution of Holy Communion. Tim, or rather Chris?
I would maybe just add briefly that I too have thought a lot about this in more normal times. I used to ask myself what then was a hypothetical question: which would be better or more efficacious, whatever word you want to put to it? Go to Mass and not receive communion, but you're offering yourself along with Christ through the hands of the priest to God the Father, or to receive communion but not go to Mass. Which one would be better, more efficacious? Well, it turns out it's not a hypothetical anymore. It's kind of a real thing. You know, it is sort of a non-question because, as you say, Father Dennis, they are supposed to go together. But it has, I think, helped me to appreciate that, as you say, the high point is the sacrificial offering. And I think if you look, say in the Gerb, it's somewhere in the 70s, it will say that as well. And this pandemic time, I think, has helped me and my kids, at least, hopefully focus in on that central reality. But now to the other, you know, just say that not everybody in the world thinks like a liturgist. Thanks be to God. Okay, so maybe you know, my neighbor doesn't realize this and you know, finds a greater solace and consolation in receiving the Eucharist, and maybe hasn't been formed how to join in the Eucharistic prayer. I think that you know, this is precisely that fine line of accommodation that the Church does make rights to accommodate people and to meet their spiritualities, to receive them outside of Mass. So I think it's it's not the ideal option, but it's a legitimate option that I think many pastors and bishops rightly choose.
It's legitimate to provide for communion outside of Mass. My concern is when you'd have Mass immediately followed by communion. That is my concern.
Yeah.
But this also brings up another question about participating in the Eucharistic prayer and the live stream celebrations of Mass. Our participation in the Eucharistic prayer can only happen in person, right? It's not possible to participate in the Eucharistic prayer vis-a-vis a screen. And that's why it's problematic to even use that verb, to participate, when you're at a screen. Authentic participation happens when I'm uniting myself with the actual offering of Christ as it's actually occurring, which is an in-person encounter. And I think that also figures into this discussion a little bit as well, because communion is what brings forward, in a rather climactic way, my actual interior participation with that offering of Christ that happened in the Eucharistic prayer in person. So, okay, Tim.
Well, that helped answer one other question that just came in. So you guys are winning.
Oh, good.
Questions in high degrees of efficacy. There are some questions, I think, though, around the virtual nature of either televised masses and how to participate in them in some way. There are a lot of families that don't want to participate in it. I heard Chris say that there's alternatives to that, the Liturgy of the Hours. I wonder if there's one, could you think about an ideal way of participating? I know it's not an authentic, I know it's not participation the way you said, but you know, I'll give an example. My family, we have been listening to the Mass when we couldn't go live streaming. We listened to it while devoting our attention to a crucifix on the wall with a book of the Gospels open. And the soundscape was actually quite essential for those of us who couldn't regularly be in a church, right? We couldn't go. There was no way for us to hear it, and it was part of our devotional life. So is there ways, or especially when we think that November may come around, we may be back in a similar situation, how do we make it so that, how do we make live stream the best possible that it could be, I suppose, is the kind of questions I'm getting.
I think we have to do that, okay? Fortunately, we live in a time where it is possible to live stream everything, not only the celebration of Mass, but so many things. Many of the funerals that I had during the period of COVID-19, before we entered this new phase, the yellow phase here in the state of Pennsylvania, were live streamed, and it was a great consolation to people. I had a wedding the other day where there were only 5 people at the wedding. It was live streamed. It was very consoling to the families and friends of that couple. So I want to say 2 things about live stream celebrations. First of all, they're beneficial and they're possible, and we should do it. However, I don't want to say it's equal to the in-person event, but on the other hand, if we're going to do it, it should be beautiful, excellent, and engaging. And I think the church has to take the lead to identify what is spiritually opportune about it. Like, just to give you an example, during the Triduum, and I'm sure this was true for you, Chris, in the Diocese of La Crosse at the Cathedral, it was a very unusual Triduum. You know, planning for these wonderful celebrations with an empty church. But people were there via live stream. And so on Good Friday, when we had the veneration of the cross in the cathedral, we invited people in their homes at that point to go to their crucifix and venerate the crucifix in their homes. Not so much indicating that that they were actually with us in the liturgical event, but there was a fruitfulness in their spiritual participation by watching the liturgical event. So I think our understanding needs to be clear, our language needs to be precise, and how we direct people vis-a-vis a live stream celebration. I don't want to discount it, but I want to be careful in how we talk about it, even going into the future, because we're not going to be able to stop live streaming the celebration of Mass. It's something that I think is going to endure. And as it was in the past, a great benefit to shut-ins and homebound people, it reminds me now that I need to help those who are at home and shut in understand its place and its value spiritually. But I think we always have to be clear that we cannot switch out the sofa for the pew. Okay, Chris?
No, I wouldn't add anything, Father Dennis.
Okay.
All right. Question about sacraments of initiation. How and when should they be celebrated?
Wow, okay. This is not easy. And it goes back to the Chrism Mass topic as well. The sacraments of Christian initiation are intimately associated with liturgical time, especially for adults. And so it was not possible for us to celebrate them at the Easter Vigil. I was hoping here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia, we would have been able to celebrate them at the Pentecost Vigil. But we were still in what was called the red phase, where only 10 people could gather. And so it's going to be very unusual, but the rites of the church do allow us to celebrate those sacraments at another time and in other ways.
They call those unusual times, don't they? That's
Yes,
the verbiage in the book.
Yes, unusual times. So the one thing I would say to those of you who are responsibility for men and women who are looking forward to receiving the Easter sacraments now is to do it as soon as possible. I mean, they have been preparing and waiting and longing for these sacraments, that as soon as you can come together and do it, do it. I found it so strange keeping our Christian initiation community together all throughout the 50 days of Easter with mystagogia topics, and the sacraments still haven't been received. But that's just part of the irregularity of this pandemic period. But I would say they should be celebrated as soon as possible.
Yeah.
Chris.
At Adoramus Bulletin or adoramus.org, there's a post that came up last week on celebrating sacraments of initiation during unusual times, because I'm not mistaken, for at least the baptism of adults or even the combined rites, it's all written, as Father Dennis is suggesting, at the Easter Vigil. And so there's some practical adjustments and adaptations that need to be accounted for if it's not at the Easter Vigil. And so that entry can help to maybe in your planning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I shared that link that Chris mentioned in the chat if you'd like to look at that article.
Thank you.
A question about outdoor masses, how to think best about them, especially out of the principles that we've been operating here. And of course, then there's the question of weddings, right? Weddings can't always be done out of doors. You need special permission for that. What do we do there? So that's from Amy.
Chris, I'm going to let you start with that one.
All right, I'll start. So just as Father Dennis was talking about sacred time as being kind of a fundamental ritual element, you can't see it or taste it or smell it or anything, so too is a liturgical place. And I think the building is a part of that sacramental ritual fabric that helps to manifest Christ to us and helps us to worship him. And which is why the norms say what they do, that Mass should be celebrated in a sacred place. Now, I mean, who of us would say these haven't been unusual times calling for, particular adaptations? This is precisely what the webinar is about. And again, this is one in particular where I think good and reasonable and well-formed and orthodox priests, faithful, and bishops can disagree on that the setting the outdoor setting may possibly just not be the right one. See, things in the ritual can be so out of normal that it does more perhaps to inhibit the encounter than to facilitate the encounter. I think this is the debatable point. Is an outdoor setting in a parking lot where cars are spaced every other slot, is that an acceptable element of the ritual medium that helps us to worship and helps us to receive God's grace? But to the point I was making before, it's no longer just enough to say, well, what do the rules say? Okay, because they say you shouldn't. Okay, so now you have to rely upon other thinking, other justification, other authority, other more basics of I think liturgical theology to come to a decision like that. So my own opinion, if anybody cares about that, is that I think it's possible that I'm sure it's happened, that a priest and a parish and people can make this a very, I'm convinced that Father Daniel Cardot is doing this. On the other hand, if my parish were to do this, I don't think I would go, but I don't know. It's a difficult question. Father Dennis?
Yeah, I also find it a difficult question because the whole notion of sacred space is so compromised today, and I see it especially when it comes to the question of the outdoor wedding. You know, the church has made a lot of progress in linking the celebration of the sacrament of marriage with the sacrament of the Eucharist and the rites of marriage taking place at the altar, because of the connection between the oblation that the couple offer to each other, which flows from the offering that Jesus makes for all of us. But unless there's a certain standardization of practice, then that's lost on people. And that certainly isn't visible outdoors. Not that an outdoor wedding can't happen with the permission of the bishop, but we lose sight of the validity and the integrity of the sacramental celebration in a place that has been shaped for the mystery of Christ, especially the altar. I myself have a great deal of trouble with a parking lot mass where people are lined up as if they're at a drive-in movie. That is not the communio that Christ establishes with his body in the liturgical assembly. Now, St. Charles Borromeo, great saint, he was the Bishop of Milan during a terrible time of plague, and churches were closed down. And he had outdoor masses. But like Chris said about Father Cardot, and I'm sure this is the case as well, they were absolutely splendid as far as the altar, the song, the rites. And that is hard to achieve. But the starting point in that situation is the starting point we're describing today. So I line up with Chris here. It's a difficult topic, and not easy to find a common ground in the conversation. Tim.
Yeah, so there's some questions that came in. I think people are listening to, the question of shut-ins, right? So this seems to sort of bring us into a communion with those who often are unable to receive the Eucharist for whatever reason. But a question I think is worth dealing with is, a lot of these norms are still discouraging for the time being those who are in particularly who have are more prone or sort of more more margin on the margins relative to receiving the virus. It's more contagious for them. So especially those above 65 have been encouraged to stay at home. And so what kind of ways do we prepare them spiritually, theologically for this moment? How does the community stay in communion with them?
Okay, that's a very good question. One of the things that has concerned me is that once there was the suspension of public masses, and it was nearly universal in the United States, that's all you heard was that the obligation to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days was lifted until further notice. One of the things that I tried to follow that up with here in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia is that it's still the Lord's Day. And the commandment is to keep holy the Lord's Day. The commandment is not to go to Mass on Sunday, but we go to Mass on Sunday because as Christians, we keep holy the Lord's Day with the sacrifice of Christ. And so a catechesis was immediately necessary to help people to pray in their homes. Maybe they might view a live stream celebration of Mass, but it was more important for them to reflect at some point in their homes on the offering of Christ to the Father and his resurrection on Sunday. And so I think to your question, Tim, and going forward, that's a point that has to be even impressed upon shut-ins and people who are home all the time and cannot come out regularly for Mass, but even for those now who are fearful of making a return to Mass, to keep holy the Lord's Day in some way. It's a piece that we haven't been as consistent about, side by side with letting people know they can stay home.
Chris, anything to add?
No.
All right. Okay, so there is one question about Eucharistic exposition and adoration and devotions. And so to what degree is this the time to reintroduce their use? How do they relate to the Eucharist? How do we do that well? How do we do that not well?
Well, Chris?
Yeah. Well, putting aside the question of whatever COVID or pandemic or diocesan restrictions there might be on what Corpus Christi is coming up. I don't know how many places we'll see their annual procession this year. But putting those aside, it seems to me this should be maybe another one of those silver linings of this whole thing, is to maybe realize that our faith life requires more than the Mass. It requires the Mass, but more than that. And whether it's liturgy of the hours or Eucharistic adoration or a more robust devotional life, I think that's one point that hopefully is clear to many people, that when the Mass isn't there, there's got to be other things. And so
Right.
I would think that this is the time to be more aware of these other, I don't know if supplemental is the right word, but these other liturgies and devotions that surround the sacrifice of the Mass.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think that coming to a better appreciation of Eucharistic exposition and adoration is always a good thing and has been present in many places during the pandemic. I know that it was quite popular here in our area for Eucharistic processions to be taking place throughout the pandemic. And it's also a way to understand what is communion all the time and help us appreciate what the reception of communion actually is. So I would agree with that 100%. And perhaps it is part of the silver lining.
We have about no more than 5 minutes. And I have one question that I think has not yet been touched on. So it's worth doing so. Is that, we're likely a while from a vaccine, and there's a good chance of a fall resurgence. And unlike March, we can be prepared in a way that we weren't in March. And so how do we start preparing people for the kind of participation we're talking about that may involve, once again, returning to our homes, right? How do we get this sort of authentic sense? If you were advising a diocese or leading diocesan offices of worship, as you both do, what would you be doing to prepare parishes, families for this possibility come November?
Well, I hope that doesn't happen. I really hope and pray that doesn't happen. I do think we do need to be prepared. And as I see it right now, although this may change for me in a couple of days, I think there are 3 things that we need to focus on. Before I mention the 3 things, one of the things that has been really a blessing through the pandemic is that the church has been able to reconnect virtually with people who have been distant for some time. The church has been able to enter people's homes, and people have been praying with us in ways that we never conceived of just a short time ago. And that has been a plus. But I think that we need, in moving forward, first of all, to see that we need to make the best use of the media that's available for catechesis, liturgical instruction. It's been one thing to make the Mass available in such a wide way, but I think making it available in a way for better understanding, or looking forward to participating when that's again possible, or when people can do that, is really important. Connecting catechesis with the presentation of the liturgy. The second thing is, and following up on something that Chris said, we need to make people aware of all the other ways to worship apart from the Mass, like the Liturgy of the Hours in your home. and give new life to domestic devotions. People need to have a sense that their home is church. And we can do that now, and that would really benefit us if there was a reoccurrence of the virus. And the third thing is we have to work together. There has to be a shared corporate wisdom. I felt that during this period, we were all on our own in many ways. So this diocese is doing that, and this diocese is doing that. And I think we're at a point where we could work more closely together, and best practices could be shared. And that would be if the virus returns, and even if it doesn't, because this pandemic, 11 weeks, 12 weeks, has caused all of us to do a lot of thinking, a lot of reflecting, and to introduce many practices where we can certainly benefit from the wisdom of one another. So those three things I would say as part of a response to that question.
I might say from my point of view is I think each of us should do some sort of examination of how we did over the last month as an individual Catholic, as a parent, as a pastor, as whatever it might be. How well or how poorly, what would I have done differently if this comes around the next time? So I'll be ready. The second thing I think would be, I think there needs to be sort of a post-pandemic pastoral plan so that some of the lessons that we may have learned, hopefully, are not lost. And that, in light of our examination, we don't lose the benefits that have been to us or who have come to us. And I would say maybe the last thing is, if you're like me or maybe Father Dennis, it's like you've been writing sacramental guidelines for weeks, and every 2 days a state law would change, or a city law would change, or an ecclesial law would change, and so you'd rewrite everything again. And so maybe these guidelines that were written at the 11th hour to get out ASAP, it might be good to go back in a more, hopefully, a peaceful time and say, how should these look next time, if there is a next time? So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you.
Well, that's it.
Okay. Tim, you did a wonderful job moderating those questions. Thank you.
Yes, just some notes on the side, just, in the group chat, if you're interested in registering for next week's webinar, there's a link in there to how to register once more when we take up the topic of liturgical music at the same time. So just a note about the chat box.
I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm especially grateful to Chris. Thank you so much. And to Father Cardot and to Tim and Mary Catherine, who is the secretary. I see her here. Mary Catherine, thank you. If you want to learn more about the society or you want to become a member, please go to the website of the society. And I think Tim posted that earlier in response to someone's question. I encourage you to look at our journal, Antiphon, maybe subscribe to it if you're not a member. If you're a member, you'll receive the journal. And I want to remind you at this point, in addition to the next two webinars on music and devotions, that is next Thursday and the following Thursday, that we're planning a virtual conference this September 26, 2020. And this is in lieu of our in-person conference that was to take place at Notre Dame that we needed to postpone until 2021. So some things to keep on the horizon for yourselves, the upcoming webinars and the conference in September. It was really wonderful to be with you, and I hope that this was helpful to you. I think it was a good conversation, and it certainly makes a contribution at this time as we're coming out of COVID, helping us stay focused on what the liturgy is and how we do make adaptations if necessary. So thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you.
And just one note, sorry, it will also be available via recording on the Society's Catholic Liturgy website, so you can share this with others. So thanks for the good work.
Thank you.